Well, hey, good morning, everybody. I'll give sound a chance to possibly adjust too, because I'm probably a louder talker than Ken, especially in the microphone, because I'm used to this. But hey, it's really, really good to be here this morning. This summer, I was in here messing around with the sound system, helping stuff kind of get put together. It's really cool to see the room actually have people in it, which is awesome. I'm Pastor Ken's brother Ted, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here this morning. And also, just a huge thank you to New Life Church. I know some of you guys have been around for a super, super long time, like DeLucas and my parents, and even Grandma and Grandpa Hill. You guys have been here forever, and the investment that you made all those years back and continue to make even today is what is the kind of thing that allowed me to do what I do now. And I still have my Bible from when, actually there's a cool story about this, maybe I'll tell this later if I have more time, but I still have my Bible from high school. Take all the time I want? Okay. So this is my Bible from high school. Well, first, I want to start with a little bit of scripture. That way, if I die while I'm up here, at least God got to talk first, okay? Well, Hebrews 10:25 says, "Let's not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." So I just want you guys to give yourselves a huge pat on the back, because in a culture right now where people are avoiding going to church and trying to use every excuse possible to not get together in a faith community, you guys are still doing that. So that is awesome. And just remember that, it's more important as the day approaches, the capital D day, right? And I think we can all agree that even if it's not happening tomorrow, every day that we are alive is another day that we're closer to the end of time, right? So it's more and more important to start coming to church, especially to see people backing away from it and not being engaged in our faith communities. It's a big deal that you're here. So congratulations for that. I wanted to just say thank you to New Life Church for all the investment that was poured into me. I learned how to lead worship here from Deb Goodrich and Todd Johankin and Rob Rogers, and all those people back in the day, right? And helping me to figure out kind of who I was, what I was called to do. And when I graduated high school, I got this Bible, took it with me to college, and then I lost it. I was so sad. And I was just like, God, help me get that Bible back. And 10 years later, this guy over Facebook messages me. He's like, "Hey, are you Ted S? That lost the Bible maybe somewhere?" And I'm like, "What?" Because it's got my name engraved on the front, right? From the high school stuff, they always get the name engraved. "Are you Theodore Snyder that lost the Bible?" I was like, "Yeah." So it turns out he's the brother of a girl who used to help lead worship up at college. And I had put this in the music box one day and completely forgot about it. And she ended up bringing that home, and he found it in his stuff from when she moved out. So I got it back and sent it in the mail and everything. It was awesome.
Wow, that's
really cool. Still had all my notes and stuff in it from really formative years in learning about God and all that stuff. In 2007, Lisa and I got married here, right over there, against that wall. And we were just kind of you know what, I think we're starting this new family, we need to figure out kind of what our faith looks like as a family together. And so we kind of went on a very short journey to figure out where we were going to kind of plant our flag and do ministry. And we ended up at the Crossing at the time, a couple years ago, changed the name to Free Grace, still the same church. But I started leading worship there and got lots of really great opportunities to do ministry. And Pastor Ken's totally right. You guys all have a part in what I was able to do there because of the investments that were made into me, were poured into me by this church. And the prayers and all those things that continually go over the students here and people that missionaries abroad and here at home. Anytime that you prayed for missionaries here, you were praying for me, because that's kind of how I saw myself and saw our family as missionaries to Minnesota, to where we were in Elk River. And so I got a lot of really cool opportunities there. I got to lead a team of musician volunteers, actually creatives in general, over 100 people. like helping people meet Jesus and leading people to Christ and through all that. And it's funny that you mentioned the stomach, like to church, the hands and the stomach, because that's the way that I see that, Paul talks about the different parts of the body are all important, right? And I've had this exact conversation with people before, I don't think with you, but I see free grace as like the mouth. It's really loud, and it gets like in people's face all the time, and it also draws in people. And I've actually likened New Life Church to the stomach, because it's where like all of the nutrients are like pushed throughout the body, right? So when you're sending somebody out in the mission field, it's an important part of the body because it's nourishing all of these other parts of the body. So it's really cool to be a part of that interconnected faith family, and I'm just so blessed by you guys. So thank you for allowing me to be here today and speak a little bit. The message that when Pastor Ken called me, I was kind of like, okay, I know we're going to talk about worship, but I don't really know in what context. And so I was just kind of throwing it out there to God at first, because it's a couple months ago. I didn't want to prepare too much in advance or I'd drive myself crazy. So I was like, God, just kind of download into my brain what you want me to talk about. And the message that we have today is kind of it's an interesting and different one about worship than maybe you've heard before, and it's kind of challenging too. So I'm just going to kind of prep you in advance for that. It's not meant to be condemning or make anybody feel bad. So if you feel bad at the end of this, you can talk to me or talk to Pastor Ken and we'll pray with you. Like, you shouldn't feel bad. But it is meant to be challenging, especially for people who live in America, which is all of us, right? And by the way, hi to everybody who's watching this a little bit later online. My hope and prayer is that you'll be able to find a way to get here and be physically in a place with fellow believers very, very soon. Do whatever it takes to get here, guys, because this is a faith community that you need to be a part of that is going to help you push through the challenging stuff that you're going through in your life, whatever that is. So show up, get here. Enough with that. We're going to go ahead and jump in. We're going to be in the book of 1 Samuel today. So if you got your Bible, crack that open, 1 Samuel chapter 4. But what I want to first do is just ask you and let you think for a second. Why are you here? Just kind of let that sink in. Why are you here this morning? Why are you here, in a deeper sense? Like, why do you exist? We're going to be exploring that a little bit more this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to 1 Samuel, and we're going to read a good chunk of it because it's never bad to read the Bible. All right. So, 1 Samuel chapter 4. Now the Israelites went out. Chapter 4, and Samuel's word came to all Israel. It's weird how sometimes the chapters start with the ending of the last chapter, but all right. Now, the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek, and the Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to the camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh so that it may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." That's a really important sentence. You might want to underline that one. We'll be back there in just a second. So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, these guys were bad guys, by the way, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "We're in trouble. Nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us! Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the desert. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of the covenant of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died in that. So let's move ahead to chapter 5.
Awesome Saul.
Yeah, that was a bad day, right?
Yes, it was.
So chapter 5, after the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod, and they carried the ark into Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon, which is just a graven image of a god named Dagon. When the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took the statue of Dagon and put him back in his place. But the following morning when they rose, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground again before the ark of the Lord. But this time, his head and his hands had been broken off, and they were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. That's why to this day, neither the priests of Dagon nor any others who enter Dagon's temple at Ashdod step on the threshold, because their god's pieces were broken off and lying on it. The Lord's hand was heavy upon the people of Ashdod and its vicinity. He brought devastation upon them and affected them with tumors, which that's scary. When the men of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, "The Lord of the God of Israel must not stay here with us, because his hand is heavy upon us and upon Dagon our God." So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and asked them, "What shall we do with the ark of God of Israel?" And they answered, "Have the ark of God of Israel moved to Gath." So they moved the ark of the God of Israel to Gath. But after they moved it, the Lord's hand was against that city, throwing it into great panic. He afflicted the people of the city, with both young and old, with an outbreak of tumors. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. As the ark of God was entering Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, "They have brought the ark of God of Israel around us to kill us and our people." So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and said, "Send the ark of God back to Israel. Let it go back to its own place, or it will kill us and our people, for death had filled the city with panic." God's hand was very heavy upon it, and those who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the outcry of the city went up to heaven. There's lots of big story there. I want to give you just a tiny little bit of background at the time. So in the book of 1 Samuel, it basically picks up where Judges left off. So if you have read Judges, you know that it's like the craziest time for Israel in the Bible. It's like the most bloody, gory, disgusting things that happen in the Bible happen in Judges. It's not family friendly, so if you're going to have your kids read the Bible, maybe read that part with them. But it's a testament to how messed up people are, especially Israel. And it's all because people just did what was right in their own eyes. They didn't have a king. They were trying to do everything except for follow God. So there's just all these terrible things that happen. And Samuel is actually like seen as the last judge of Israel before they start having kings, King Saul. Right? So that's kind of the landscape that this story takes place in. Is like everything is a huge mess. Israel is really bad at worshiping God. They're constantly worshiping other gods and stuff, but they still have the Ark of the Covenant. It's still a thing, but they definitely don't have it all right. And before we go ahead and start judging Israel for that, let's just be honest. Like, we don't get it all right all the time either, right? Like, we're definitely messed up people too. And so I really like to look at these kinds of stories and put myself in their shoes a little bit and say, you know what, if I was dealing with the same things they were dealing with so many years of bloodshed and a mess, I don't know if I would act any differently, honestly. Like, people are people, and people make mistakes, and especially in a culture where things like killing your neighbors is normal, all of a sudden it would be weird of me to think that I wouldn't be capable of something like that. Does that make sense? So let's take a look at this story again. We're just going to kind of break it down and go through this story with a little bit of that mindset in mind. This is a talk on worship, but we'll get into how that makes sense in just a little bit. Because you're like, there's no singing in this story, and a bunch of people died, and that's not, I mean, nobody died when we were worshiping just a minute ago. Like, how does that have to do with anything? So let's take another look at the passage. Right away, you see that Israel went up to fight against the Philistines, and they go in this battle, and the Philistines, like, hit them hard. And they're like, oh my gosh, 4,000 people just died. Think about that. 4,000 people died. They're like, gosh, this is really, really bad. So it says, 4,000. When the soldiers returned to the camp, the elders of Israel asked, why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? That's actually a pretty good question to ask. Like, why did this bad thing happen? Like, what's the message God's trying to send? But then they came to kind of a weird conclusion. Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh so that it may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies. Really important distinction here. They didn't say, let's bring God into this. They said, let's bring the Ark of the Covenant. That's like our magic genie lamp. Because it worked in the past. Whenever they brought the Ark of the Covenant, then awesome stuff happened, and they won. So let's bring the Ark. Forgetting that the whole point of the Ark is that God is there, right? So they go and they get this Ark, and it doesn't work, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, right? Have you ever gotten cause and effect screwed up? Like you think that the cause of something, or the effect of something is caused by this other cause. I don't know if you know this, but a long time ago, people used to think that just natural, like certain bugs and animals, like small animals, could just be born out of nothing, basically. So for example, they would have they say like the frogs were born from mud, not from other frogs, but they're like, well, the mud's there and the frog's there, so that's where the frogs come from, is mud. Rats were born from garbage. Like literally garbage would turn into rats. That's kind of what people thought. This is funny. A guy wrote down a recipe for bees, okay? Kill a young bull and bury it with an upright position so its horns protrude from the ground. After a month, a swarm of bees will fly out from the corpse. That's where bees come from, everybody. You just plant a dead animal in the ground and bees come out. Here's another one. Jean-Baptiste van Helmont's recipe for mice. Place a dirty shirt or some rags in an open pot or barrel containing a few grains of wheat or some wheat bran, and in 21 days, mice will appear. There will be adult males and females present, and they'll be capable of mating and reproducing more mice. Which is really interesting. Like, he understood that mice come from mice, but he couldn't figure out, like, that maybe they were just, like, getting into the barrel. But it's funny, we do the same thing all the time when it comes especially to faith, right? Israelites did the same thing. They looked at the effect, which was when they brought the Ark of the Covenant, then stuff would happen, they would win. But we do it too, right? We associate certain periods of spiritual growth in our lives with what God was doing during that time. And so we double down on it. So almost treating it like a machine for spiritual maturity, or a machine for blessing. So for example, if you were really growing spiritually during a time where God was calling you to serve in your church, chances are when you're feeling kind of like, I'm feeling kind of stagnant spiritually, the first place you're going to go is to serving. That's not a bad thing, but that's a lot of times when we see people burn out from serving. Anybody experience burnout? I know I have, for sure. And a big piece of it is because when you were growing spiritually, you were serving, so it's just kind of in your head, you get that cause and effect sort of setup. Like, this is what I do. This is how I jump through the hoop to feel connected to God again. Or if you're in a season of learning, right? We see this happen a lot too. Christians become really smart about Bible and God and all that stuff, and then they grow spiritually mature, they feel really close to God, and then all of a sudden they start to kind of feel like something's missing in my faith. So then they double down, I have to learn more, I have to figure out more, and they start learning all the big words for all the different ideas, and really digging into certain topics. This isn't a bad thing, but it can lead to puffery, right? Like pride, thinking, oh, I know more than you about the Bible, so therefore I'm better than you. Or maybe you felt really connected to God at one point when you attended a new church. And I've seen this happen a lot over the years. People come into a new church and oh my gosh, I'm growing so much spiritually, and then over time, and they feel really connected to God. And then over time it starts to kind of wane, and they're like, oh, I must have to go find a new church. Rather than figuring out what's the new thing that God's trying to do in me, they just go back to what used to work in the past, which isn't necessarily the next level that God's trying to take them. And what that ends up doing is it stunts their spiritual maturity. They always end up being at this spot, and then that church doesn't work out for a while, so then they hop to another church, and they hop to another church, and they don't really actually grow roots deep down. They don't figure out how to start serving and start learning, and the whole gambit of what it looks like to be a follower of Christ. So what is God's heart and hope that we would experience in Christianity, right? It's relationship. God actually wants to have relationship with us. And this is where worship enters the conversation. Because worship isn't just music. This is one of the things that I talk about a lot at our church, is that worship is so much more than music, but people have really turned it into this thing. It's like, this is the button that I push when I want to worship God. I turn on music, or I go to a worship service where there's music, and then I sing along, and then I worshiped. And it's so much greater than that. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a second. But first of all, also, I was thinking about this. Because 40,000 people, 34,000 people total died in the Israel camp. It's a lot of people. That's, if Target Field is packed out, that's 39,000 people. So just imagine that many people just died. You would probably do some pretty ridiculous things too, right? I know I would be like literally freaking out. What are we gonna do? And so it can be really easy to judge people in Scripture, be like, oh man, they're so silly. They thought that they could get mice out of, putting garbage in a bucket. But honestly, I think, again, we would probably react in a lot of the same ways if we were put in that culture, in that time, with all the same events that were happening. So remember, just keep an open mind as we read through this Scripture, because I think a lot of it really applies to us today. So this brings me to the next piece. So they set the Ark of the Covenant. So the bad guys, all right, so we move ahead to chapter 5. They stole the Ark of the Covenant, and they put it in the temple next to Dagon. Dagon was just a popular god for the Philistines, represented a lot of prosperity and fertility and things like that. And they brought the Ark of the Covenant of God and they set it next to this other statue, this other idol. Now, I moved my page to the wrong thing. So this brings us into kind of the main topic of our message, which is idolatry. Because if we're going to have a conversation about worship, idolatry has to be a piece of what we talk about. Because this brings us to our question that I started off with. Why are we here? Why are we here today? Why were we even put here on earth at all? The answer is worship. That's what humans were created for. That's what church is for. It's to come together to worship corporately, but also just in our everyday lives, that's what we are meant for. If you're looking for purpose in your life, and you're like, I don't know what my purpose is, I don't know what my calling is, your first and foremost calling is to be a worshiper of God. Whatever that looks like. Now, it doesn't, again, not just music. You don't have to be able to sing in order to be a worshiper of God. But let's just talk a little bit about, I wrote down a thing, I don't think I'll go into it, but actually I will, because that's fun. But Isaiah 43, 20 through 21 says something. Let me just go ahead and turn to it here about this. Job, Psalms. 43. Yep, Isaiah 43. It's a pretty important verse about the purpose of mankind. Come on. 39, 41.
It's long.
42.
48.
There we go. Yeah, it would happen, right? You turn and then you get a clump. And then it's on 48. 43:20 says, one more page. You guys are on your phones, you're like, I've already read this 15 times today.
No.
God says, the wild animals honor me, the jackals and the owls, because I provide water in the desert and streams in the wasteland to give drink to my people, my chosen. The people I formed for myself, that they may proclaim my praise. God's pretty clear. I made people for myself, like that's why they exist, so that they'll praise me. Like that's what our purpose is. It makes me think about a cartoon that I think is super funny. It's not always appropriate, but there's this guy who makes lots of robots and inventions and stuff, and one morning he sits down at his table and they're eating pancakes. And he turns on this little robot, and it comes over and like cuts a little slab of butter and like puts it on his pancake. And all of a sudden, like the robot becomes self-aware and it says, "What is my purpose?" and the scientist says, "You serve butter." And the robot goes, "Oh no." Like, his purpose is so tiny. We have this amazing, awesome purpose, right? To worship and be connected to the creator of everything. And I just love that. So, back to the story, they put this Ark of God next to this idol of something else. And we do that all the time, especially in America. Like, as part of the Christian church, we have a lot of things that we can relate to the children of Israel on when we read the Old Testament, but especially as the Church of America, we have a ton of things that we can relate to with the bad guys in the Old Testament. Like, Ken's nodding because he's like, totally. If you read the Old Testament and you think like, what were the bad guys worshiping? You see that all the time in American culture. The idols that they worship. We worship the same things, we just usually take the idol part out, like the graven image part out, but it's still there. So let's talk about for a second how to find idols in your life, okay? So first of all, I'm going to give you a couple examples of common American idols. Gosh, that's an old reference. Is that show even around anymore?
Yeah.
Yes,
Wow.
in addition to others.
Yeah, it's true. But as I'm reading these off, I actually want you to really think about what are the things that I worship other than God. And by worship, we'll talk a little bit more about how to really define that. But first of all, what is most likely to make me want to skip reading the Bible? What distracts me most from prayer? What keeps me from sharing my faith with other people? What causes me to fall into sin most often? What one thing, if taken away from me, would absolutely devastate me and maybe even make me give up on or question whether faith is even worth it at all? So, like I said, this is a little bit of a challenging message because I think we can pretty easily start putting a list together of things that qualify there. But common American examples, and this I think applies to everybody in this room, including myself: work, politics, money, food, relationships, sex, children, success, human adoration, human acceptance, entertainment, comfort, the need for control, possessions, prosperity, or poverty. You can worship poverty too, just like you worship prosperity. Freedom. As the guy talking up here, I'm not immune to any of these things. I can honestly and safely say I've idolized all of these things in my personal life, and there's still some that I work on. But the interesting thing here is that it doesn't have to be a bad thing to be an idol. In fact, most idols that people worship are actually good things. They just became a God thing. Like, it's good to care for your family, but if you start worshiping your children and it makes it so you never go to church or never read your Bible and you hover, your entire life revolves around them, but you're not doing that in the context of a greater relationship with God, now all of a sudden you've turned your children into an idol. And if you do even like a little tiny study into idol worship in the Old Testament, or even if you look at like the Greek gods, they represent a lot of the things that we still worship today. Because like all those things that I just said, like work, politics, money, food, relationships, sex, children, success, like those things all just had images. They had idols that went along with them. So in American culture, this is definitely a big thing, and this is getting in the way of us worshiping God. So I want you to actually just think about, and you can write this down in code or something so the person next to you isn't judging you if you need to. But literally write down, what are 3 things that are contenders for idolatry in my life? It's okay, I have my 3 already written down because I worked ahead. Go ahead and take a second. I'm going to drink some water. Here's an interesting example. There was a season for me where ministry was an idol. I worshipped doing ministry more than the God I was doing the ministry for. It's a pretty easy trap to fall into. It was actually my answer to a lot of those questions. What keeps me from reading the Bible? Well, I have to go and I have to do more. Like, you think about like Mary and Martha, right? Martha was focused so much on ministry that she missed Jesus, right? And so that's a really easy thing to fall into worshiping as well. This is what I love, though. Check this out. You go back to the story that we're reading in 1 Samuel chapter 5. They set the Ark of God next to this idol of Dagon. And then the next morning they wake up, and the idol was bowing down to the Ark, or to God, right? It was bowing down to God.
That's cool.
And they're like, well, I don't know how that happened. It must have fallen over at night. So the next morning, so they fix it, they set it back up, and then the next morning it fell over and it was broken in front of the Ark of God. And I love this story because it is how this shows us the heart of God. That he will not, no matter how good something is, he will not let your idols win.
Yeah.
He will not let your idols stand before his presence. That's why coming to church is such a big deal. I don't know if you guys experience it every time you worship, but I literally feel like I'm laying down idols in front of God. Like this thing that I was holding on to, I'm putting at your feet. Like this thing that I'm worried about, it's causing me stress. Chances are it's because there's an idol in my life. I'm laying it down at your feet.
Yes. Blessed be the
It's beautiful. Yeah, it's a really cool picture of what worship is really about. It's about God saying, I'm not going to let your idols win. I've had this conversation a lot too with, it's funny how this happens a lot in real life. So, I talk a lot with young guys, like dating age, looking to try to get married or whatever. And we'll be having these conversations. They're like, I've been trying for so long to just find the right woman to marry and dating. It's just not working and all this stuff. And they're like, you know what? I'm just going to take a year off from doing that, and I'm just going to focus on my relationship with God. And I can honestly say, every single one of those guys that I had that conversation with, and they said that, they met their wife within like a couple months of saying that. And it was because they said, you know what? I'm going to stop trying to serve this idol of a relationship. Instead, I'm going to serve God. And God's like, sweet, now that you're okay with that thing submitting to me, now you can have it. But until that point, I'm not going to let you have it because you're just going to worship that woman for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And it's really cool how God does that in lots of different areas of our lives, right? He won't let our idols win, and it's a beautiful and it's a great thing, but it's also, it can be a painful thing. Like I said, when I